Okay, I mean, so my background, academically and in terms of my, actual career path is really, I'm an evolutionary biologist. And so I've been very concerned with, interested in the, let's say, the origins of novelty as a sort of a fundamental question in evolutionary biology. And then because I've had a very long-term interest in philosophy, and even my PhD was partly in history and philosophy of science. This sort of naturally extended for me into a consideration, really over the last decade of not just the origins of novelty within biology, not just the kinds of, molecular biology systems, and specifically I've done a lot of work on the evolution of toxins in various in basically in chemical ecology, but in poisonous and venomous organisms. But the basic form of the question sort of has sprawled out from there, from my sort of empirical basis in that kind of research, and become a very generic question about, let's say, the origins of structure in general. And so that had led me to connect with a lot of different philosophical paradigms. Ultimately, I'm of course attracted to process relational views, being fundamentally what I think of as an evolutionary thinker. But there are, models in generalized selectionism, all sorts of things there. And so when it comes to this question that, Mike's got us together to discuss today about the existence, although that might be the wrong term, especially if we're going to use scholastic terms, but the reality, let's say, of a realm, again, loaded term, not sure I like that term, but of a latent space, as Mike is calling it, of more or less definite potential, so more or less definite possibilities that are not as yet actualized. When it comes to that kind of consideration, I think in the first place, it's important for me to say I'm very sympathetic to that. I think we need that kind of account. We need it in evolutionary biology. In a sense, it's built in to the kind of reasoning that you see in evolutionary context, in generalized selectionism. But there are a lot of devils in the details, for sure. And so there are a lot of different philosophical approaches to this question. It's one of the big questions, right? It's a very, very big ancient question. And so a lot of ink, a lot of words have been spilled over this over millennia. And we can say since Plato to some degree, even though, of course, the question itself predates Plato, but Plato has this particularly influential attempt in the theory of forms, which we should perhaps get into, to solve this problem. And then in more modern philosophy, and certainly since Kant in the German idealist tradition, but then in the development of that into the certain process relationisms of people like Charles Sanders Peirce, Alfred North Whitehead, and Gilbert Simondon, Gilles Deleuze, and also in Nietzsche, in parallel, we discover this notion of an inverted Platonism. And so really the question is, yeah, what is the source of structure? What is the source of definiteness? And do we require a model which might be broadly speaking Platonist, though we should get into what that might actually mean, in which the definiteness is kind of already out there, ready to be taken up, ready to be ingressed by actual evolving systems, or ingression being Whitehead's term, or is it something that is shaped? In a relationship of adjacency, so we can definitely bring in Stuart Kaufman's notion of the adjacent possible here, but in a reciprocal relationship, and something that someone like Deleuze would call counter-effectuation with the actual. So is definiteness in the virtual, let's say, in that latent space, is that primary? And then definiteness in the actual space kind of, is formed by the ingression of those forms, or is achieved by the ingression of those forms, or do we have things backwards when we say that? And that's why we start to speak of these processual accounts of an inverted Platonism, in which a certain very nuanced notion of actuality perhaps comes first, and then definiteness in the latent space evolves within this relationship of adjacency, is always relative to some particular local actualized situation. That was a bit of a ramble, but I think that's some of the desiderata that we've come together to talk about today.
Yes, great. I think there's so many things I want to connect to. It's really great. So let me first maybe say a couple of things about my kind of motivation, how I get into this thing. So very generally, I'm kind of interested in the relation between consciousness and the study of consciousness and some more scientific or technologically based approaches. Um, Now to kind of um, be open about it. I am not a physicalist about consciousness, so I think consciousness is a fundamental thing, and that makes it specifically difficult to find this relation between like science and technology and consciousness. So I don't believe, for example, that you have like I don't know complex computations, and if you have consciousness emerging from that somehow, if you put together some complexity or so, I don't believe that thing. I think consciousness is a fundamental thing. Um, Now, I think Platonism, or some variant of Platonism, some Platonist idealism maybe, is a very suggestive way to think how those two things might be related, actually. Um, so it brings me actually to Platonism, and Timothy already said a couple of things about that. I think when we talk about Platonism, and that's so to say that the main theme of what I understand we will talk about today, it's quite important actually, I think, to distinguish three senses in which one could mean something like Platonism. So the first sense, which I would call Platonism 101, is the kind of streamlined, watered down version that we teach in undergraduate courses, Introduction to Philosophy, where you have Plato, which is basically a kind of dualism between a transcendent realm of ideas and an empirical realm, and you have the theory of forms, and then like this well-known school philosophical account. The second sense in which one can think about Platonism is what actually Plato believed, his kind of beliefs, and that's a very difficult question, and scholars are fighting over that. It's not clear that he believed that he had any coherent doctrine himself. That's just not. I mean, I philologically that's not clear. And the third thing, the third sense in which one can think about Platonism, which I think is the most interesting one, is a kind of extended Platon-like framework. So already Plato himself, in his later dialogues, like the Timaeus or so, he kind of saw that maybe there are some problems or some issues to be resolved. So it gets quite complex. So his theory of the soul, for example, is already quite complex that he lays out in the Timaeus. And usually that's a bit simplified in like Platonism 101. Also, what Timothy mentioned is inverted Platonism, like Whitehead's ideas, would count for me as, in some sense as an extended version of Platonism. It's still thinking somewhat in this framework of having the virtual or the latent space or the ideal or however you want to call it in somewhat opposition to the empirical, actual, concrete. Or Plotin, whom we now consider to be a Neoplatonist, is also actually something like considered himself to be a follower or someone who extended ideas from Plato. And he introduced the idea that you need to think about the ideal realm in terms of a hierarchy. You have a stratification. You have the one, the intellectual, the soul, and then the material, and then you have emanation and realizations in between those levels. So it's very interesting. There are many interesting modifications, which are also prompted by some, let's say, intrinsic issues of the whole framework of thinking. And that's something which I would like to explore and which I think connects very well to this question how consciousness relates to the physical empirical world.
Sorry, I was just trying to take notes here. Who did you say was with the stratifications? Who was that?
Plotin, Neoplatonism, so that's late antiquity.
But Plotinus, we normally say in English.
Plotinus, oh sorry, my German,
Got it.
yeah.
Totally fine. Just trying to help Mike make that connection. Uh, Mike, did you want to come back on that, or should I quickly
Please
respond?
go for it.
Well, I think I completely agree with Robert that I mean there are very complex questions of of scholarship and interpretation when it comes to Plato himself, and of course famously Plato hides himself for the most part in this dialogical format. He puts words in the mouths of various interlocutors. Um, there is, I mean, where we might go, and Robert's already mentioned the Timaeus, is this relationship. Like if we're thinking about the theory of forms, even though it crops up in a lot of different dialogues, and there are lots of little aspects, the Timaeus is probably a great place to drill down on just a little bit, because it is essentially Plato's, cosmology, where it's articulated. I mean, Plato's. It's a cosmology that Plato articulates. Timaeus is the one who actually, speaks it, articulates it. But then also the relationship between that and what may or may not be a later dialogue, but the Parmenides, which is also an exploration of the theory of forms and certain problems in the theory of forms. And you can read some aspects in the Parmenides as problematizing things in the Timaeus. And then that is different readings of that can be considered, again, in a sort of shorthand way, the basis of some of the trajectories that Robert's talking about. And the Neoplatonic trajectory, so Plotinus and Proclus and their followers, which has this profound influence on the Christian worldview. And that, in a sense, even though, of course, I agree with Robert, there's a Platonism 101, but in a sense, that Neoplatonic view is kind of the dominant view of Platonism that I think is sort of baked into Western culture. Whereas the Timaeus and the Parmenides and the tensions between them possibly already admit of these slightly different readings. And so I will agree with Robert that I think, Whitehead is a very I mean, of course, he famously says that, the safest general characterization of the history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. He's putting himself very much in that tradition, but with these little tweaks, which he could point to Plato and say that trajectory is already sort of outlined in the dialogues themselves. And then even these thinkers like a Nietzsche, but like a Gilles Deleuze, who are considered to be, sometimes considered to be really anti-Platonist in some sense. It's really more about this inversion of Platonism. And certainly Deleuze specifically would say that, when we invert Platonism, which is completing Nietzsche's project for him, but also he draws a lot on Whitehead and Simondon and others, it's not really an anti-Platonism. We're not escaping Platonism. In fact, we should want to uphold a number of Platonic doctrines. And in particular, Deleuze, as with these other process relational thinkers, has a very robust and central role for the virtual. So what would correspond to your latent space, Mike? So we're not, I think, in the way we navigate all of this terrain, we wouldn't be looking to escape that. Again, for me, it's what are the dependence relationships here. And again, given my underpinning question is something like, what are the origins of structure, or novel structures, or whatever, those dependence relationships become really important for me. But I'm wary we could get lost in certain details. I do think it's important probably to really quickly outline what's going on in the Timaeus, maybe for at least a kind of, here's something, here are the set of operators in a Platonic, more or less Platonic context, and then see, do we need them? Do we want them? How do those interact with contemporary science and all of that? But yeah, it can get messy, obviously. Like there's a lot going on.
How do you guys see this impacting your work in particular on a practical level? Because I think some of the most interesting aspects of this is precisely when it integrates into the real research that we're all doing. So I've got my favorites, but I'd love to hear from you guys how you see this coming into your work.
Robert, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking. So I mean, in the beginning, I said I think it's an interesting kind of framework to think about when you think about when you want to think about the relation of consciousness and the physical. So like, concretely, I've been involved a lot in work on the so-called interface theory of perception with Donald Hoffman. And so here the basic idea is that our perception, that we perceive the world, not truthfully, but tuned to utility or tuned to usefulness. So what we perceive is what is useful to us and not what's really there, so to say. So in some sense, we make interface representations of reality that allow us to act in a certain kind of useful way. And that's a very evolutionary based, or that's the way how the view is actually was produced. Like on the one hand, you had this computational theory of mind, but on the other hand, you also have an evolutionary approach to that. And if you marry that, you get to something like the interface theory of perception. And here there's an open question, which is this question, oh, what's actually beyond our interface, or what are we interfacing to? And one possible way to think about that is to say, okay, there's some, let's call it the virtual realm that we are actually always interfacing with, that we are interacting with it. And so here's one connection to some Platon-like way of thinking that I see from my own research, which I find very interesting. Yeah, I think that's the main, so to say, that's the main concrete motivation which I have for that. Of course, I also have like a philosophical, historical interest in these whole things, how things turn up in history of philosophy. I'm a philosopher. I'm a professional philosopher, philosophy of science and technology. So obviously, I'm interested in that as well, how it factors in, especially this question which becomes relevant nowadays, how to kind of incorporate some dimension of meaning and sense into what we are actually doing when we do AI and science and whatever. And here, so to say, the Platonist model might be very useful in thinking about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm also very interested in these historical questions. I'm interested, my interest in the origins of structure does extend to my interest in the origins of thought forms, let's say, so studying the history of philosophy as a way of trying to understand the evolution of the conceptual frameworks that we're deploying in different contexts is in itself a very interesting and useful task to me, and it feeds back on the sort of ontological project in important ways, because it allows us to draw into question certain things that are, say, taken for granted in a certain received view of the nature of things, and if we trace so if we do this historicist move, if we trace the history of that particular idea and back to its not necessarily original, and there's an important thing here in the way that origins do have this tendency of receding across transcendental horizons. So there's a subtle, this is going to relate to interface theory, but a subtle way that we handle the existence of these horizons, which are boundaries on our capacity to reconstruct or our capacity to perceive or whatever. And we always have this lurking question of what's on the other side, what's on the other side of that horizon, exactly as Robert was saying. But yeah, so I'm partly interested in this historical approach. I want to know why we think the things that we do, so that I can understand what kind of wiggle room we might have when we're working on an ontology. But I do think of all of these questions as coming very directly out of my work on the evolutionary origins of novelty in a slightly more, classical molecular biology framework, because there what I'm really interested in is the role of stochasticity, of sort of more or less arbitrary variations in facilitating the origins of novelty. And this kind of, again, can be tied into this notion of the adjacent possible, when you think that you have a particular already concretized, already actual form, but you have this sort of fluctuating, shimmering all around the edges of that. And that can be, you can think about this as an abstract way or even a poetic way, but of thinking about things at lots of different levels. So, it's pretty easy to think about actual genes and stochastic mutations, point mutations in that way, duplication propensities you can think about in that way. But then if you want to tie that kind of thing, the origins of novel structures in those sorts of mutational events, to the origins of novel functional traits, you have to bring in the role of gene expression, of course, and gene expression has this stochasticity inherent to it as well. And so you can think about, and I always take this term that I first heard Chris Fields use, or this analogy of babbling, right? You can think about that gene expression as constantly probing a sort of adjacent set of of possibilities that are adjacent to the current, regulatory framework that in some sense defines the NES, the non-equilibrium steady state of the organism or whatever, like it's always shimmering, probing around the edges. And so there's actually a latent space of possibilities that is concretely, it's actualized at one level already. It's concretely there in this variability of gene expression. But in order for it to be stabilized, and possibly in ways that are going to be heritable and all of that, some kind of confluence with the environment is going to occur that's going to elicit a particular arrangement, stabilize that, etc. A more classic evolutionary story. But I feel like, embedded in all of that are these deep philosophical questions already. And so when you're really drilling down on that and not, again, taking even the integration of a classic molecular biology story with the role of gene expression, stochastic gene expression in the origins of novel functions, is already taking a step outside a kind of genetic determinist framework. So again, I feel like there's a way in which the honest pursuit of insight into the questions, the origins of novel functional traits, etc., kind of can take one down this path. So they're kind of, I mean, this maybe is a bit of a flim-flam answer, but they're always already related to me. The one implies the other. And then I become really interested in what I think of as the attempt to avoid front-loading the possibility landscape. So I don't want to posit the existence of definite structures if I could potentially explain them, right? So the ideal in some sense is that all of the definiteness emerges from indefiniteness. Lots of devils in the details, right? But rather than saying these things exist, say they are eternal forms. And again, if we get to the Timaeus, we're going to talk about the operation that the eternal forms play in that cosmological dialogue. But instead of reaching straight to something that is eternal, that is timeless, and which this corresponds with the kind of mathematical Platonism that you've been referencing, Mike. The question is always, well, could we dig a little bit deeper and actually find a way to account for the emergence of those structures themselves? And that becomes a research program that is in, and I think maybe we can end this whole dialogue perhaps with talking about what such a research program would look like. But it's a research program in the foundations of mathematics, as well as in scale-free principles of self-organization in physical systems, and this historical approach to different philosophical options, and all of those things are going to interact in fascinating ways. But one of the things you've said, Mike, is that you feel like emergentism is a Mysterian thesis. Now, I would grant that as it is articulated, it's often kind of mysterious, and people always caricature it by, an algorithm proceeds to this point and then the magic happens, Obviously, I want to do a lot better than that if I'm referencing emergentism. But for me, the kind of Platonism that we see in a more or less straight reading of the Timaeus, where you have the materials themselves are not intelligent, they're ultimately chaotic. The receptacle, which comes before everything, is basically chaotic and completely disorganized. And Plato needs, and in fact, in a number of dialogues, Plato has Socrates ridicule the earlier pre-Socratic natural philosophers who believed the materials themselves could be intelligent. But Plato in the Timaeus needs these independent or transcendent operators of the demiurge, who is the only being that has access to kind of direct access, like without an interface, we might say, to the eternal forms, and the reflection, the contemplation of the eternal forms that the divine craftsman is capable of is what facilitates his, capital H, his organization of the fundamentally chaotic nature of matter. And the question, I guess, is, I see this as the more Mysterian thesis, ultimately, in the sense that it's saying, well, we can't really explain the origins or the genesis of the forms themselves. They come in as a transcendent posit, and they're what we need to explain all subsequent order in the cosmos. But that puts them, because we are limited finite humans, that puts the forms themselves, the demiurge, irrevocably on the other side of this boundary, we cannot access the account of their genesis. And so to me, that's the ultimate in mysterianism, right? I'm not sure if that makes sense or if I justified that well, but I think emergence, the promissory note of emergence, if we can take it as far as we can possibly take it, and we're going to bottom out somewhere, but if we can more, rigorously, hopefully, tell these ontogenetic stories about the origins of structure in all these different domains, that is the attempt to minimize mysterianism for me. Whereas again, positing all the definiteness existing out there in the latent space and just informing the otherwise indefinite matter, which I don't think is the position that you're taking up, Mike, but in a sense, that's a very coarse-grained, pun intended, description of what's going on in the Timaeus. And I mean, maybe if Robert wants to, or if you want to, Mike, we can drill down into more details in the Timaeus, how that relates to the theory of forms elsewhere, and all of that.
Yeah, I actually have a question to Mike relating to that. So I think that's very interesting. I think you gave a very nice summary of what's happening here, and so my question is what I'm interested in, and I think that's an open question actually. If you pursue something like a technologically driven or engineering driven project like Mike does, one important question would be if we accept this kind of Platonic or Platon-like framework, you have this forms or this virtual or however you want to call it, which you can somehow interface to. So the question is what that buys you. There seems to be something happening there, and we need to be able to say to some extent what's happening there, so to say, in order to make that useful, right? Otherwise, it's like what you said. I mean, it's in some sense also a mysterious position. You just have this kind of eternal form, and they're somehow, I don't know how it works. We copy them, we ingress or whatever we do, however we want to call it. But then that happens all the time. We do something. But what we really want to have, I mean, we want to build something, we want to engineer something, and then we want to understand, to some extent at least, how this transitions to some novel, how that shows up in some novel kind of behavior, some interesting things which are happening, which seem to point to some interesting dynamics in this eternal realm. So in that sense, eternal is a kind of well, we could talk about what that actually should mean to say something is eternal. But that's a different discussion. So I'm curious about what Mike thinks, what actually that buys you such a framework.
Yeah, and it's a critical question because I'm committed to having these kind of ideas that actually buy us something in terms of novel discoveries, right? Novel research programs and so on. So
right.
I guess I can start with this issue of mysterianism that you just brought, right? So here's the dynamic that I see in our fields when you point out some interesting property, some generic property of networks or of these kinds of emergent things, when you say, well, where does that come from? People say, well, that's just the fact that holds. It's just a fact that holds in the world. And now the benefit of that position is that it's more minimal. So then it's people who don't want to posit a non-physical realm. They want to keep their ontology very, very sparse, right? Okay, great. But the downside is that you then end up with basically a catalog of surprises, right? When we encounter these things, they are, well, oh wow, look at that, it's hexagonal, amazing. All right, well, we'll write it down, and that'll be that. Or these networks can do that. Well, amazing. So we'll write it down. So you just end up with sort of a catalog of these things, and for me, the fundamental project of science is an optimistic one where you say, no, it's not a random, we can't prove it, of course, it's a metaphysical assumption, but we're going to assume that instead of a random grab bag of stuff that holds, that we can just sort of catalog, and when we come across it, we can instead hypothesize that it's part of an ordered space, that basically what we need is a systematic research program of investigating that latent space, find out what's in it. So this now suggests that to some extent, and I agree with you, Tim, that it is a bi-directional relationship. So I don't think these things are just like fixed and whatever. But I do think that there are contents there that are we could talk about what that means. But I think in an important sense, they do pre-exist anything else that happens. And therefore, what we're doing is, and so here comes the research program. The research program, I think, is the creation of tools to really map out that space. Now, what are those tools? So mathematicians have their tools to map out their corner of that space. I see xenobots, anthrobots, all the hybrids, cyborgs, all the crazy stuff that we make as exploration vehicles. They're kind of periscopes that we stick up into that space, and we say, okay, here's what the standard frog genome allows us to see, and there's the standard frog embryo. But now we can tweak some stuff, and we can invite in some things that are sort of around that, and continue and map out systematically map out the patterns. And I use that extremely generally. So these are patterns of behavior, patterns of morphogenesis, patterns of physiological states, and so on. These patterns that I think evolution makes use of, and here I think we have to start thinking. I mean, it's popular to think about constraints, right? The number of people talk about how these things are constraints. Sure, they're constraints, but I think more interesting is the fact that they're actually free lunches in a certain sense. I see scenarios all the time where I think evolution benefits massively from the fact that you don't need to go evolve them, create them, micromanage you get handed these amazing facts for free that you can then benefit from. And so we as engineers need to learn to use these interfaces to know what's on the other side. I see this, I don't know, maybe too many years of C programming or something, but I see these things very much as pointers, right? We make these things. The structure of the pointer is important. It isn't generic, and it isn't doing nothing. It's absolutely important. But the thing with pointers is you always get more than you get more out than you put in. So you've got a pointer, but what you're pointing to is a rich data structure that you're going to be able to make use of. And now we can say, all right, well, let's make these things and let's work out the mapping. That's what I think is the research program, is to work out the mapping between the pointer, and the pointers can be extremely dumb things, triangular objects and such. And then, sort of more and more complex, and you get to sort of dip into this Platonic space of patterns. And I think that's the research program, is to create tools and then work out the mappings. What are these patterns? And so, Robert, I agree with you in that I think a lot of what's in that space are not just facts about distribution of primes and things like this, but high agency patterns that are in fact kinds of minds. And I think to some extent that is what that is the consciousness that we see. I don't think we make consciousness. I don't think we make it with AIs. I don't think we make it with embryos. I think we make interfaces to it, and basically that's what we're what we're inviting into the world. And yeah. Oh, I guess the last thing I just wanted to say about the nature of explanation and things bottoming out, right? So yeah, I agree with you that it would be nice to be able to say where the patterns themselves come from as a sort of the next step. But I feel like, at least, and I'm no mathematician at all, but at least in mathematics, I think they have a version of explanation that's kind of lateral, like things connect sideways. But I'm not sure. But at some point there are things that that's just how it is, and there isn't a notion that it has either a historical or some kind of reductive, like I mean, some things do, but eventually you get to these really fundamental patterns. It's just like, well, that's just what it is, and that seems okay, because the alternative is an infinite. Well, why is that set of why is that questions, right? Like it's got to bottom out somewhere, and then are we going to be satisfied, or are we going to say, well, that's no good? What's behind that? I don't know.
I of course agree it's going to bottom out somewhere. One of the questions is whether it bottoms out in an operational schema, or whether it bottoms out in structures or like preformed objects. And that's a very key question in the development of process relational thought. So a generic operational schema, which, you could take something like the free energy principle as an example of that, might be an account of the genesis of structure itself. And I mean, that's a whole can of worms that we could go into the distinction there. And that's part of what underlies the inversion of Platonism for a lot of the process relational thinkers. I definitely agree that we're bottoming out somewhere. but I also think that minimalism is the goal in metaphysics or in speculative ontology. So we don't want to prematurely declare that we've reached the bottom. Um, and yes, mathematicians maybe it depends on the mathematicians. I think I'm not a mathematician, but um, there are research programs in topos theory, category theory, homotopy type theory, this sort of stuff where it's looking at the what's fundamental being relations and transformations and that structures including things like discreteness itself are emergent. So there is a kind of historicizing or at least a processualizing approach in those approaches to the foundations of mathematics, as I understand it. I'm so supportive, and I really want to express that. And I think that the empirical research program that you are outlining will absolutely bear fruit because there is a latent space of more or less definite potential that is adjacent to any given actual situation. So if you manage to create a novel actuality, you will pull down never before seen, potentials, let's say. But the question is whether you can say those potential in their relative definiteness pre-existed that novel actuality. And there are a lot of ways of thinking about that. And one of the other big things in my life, as I think you know at least, Mike, is that I'm a musician. I'm a very, very keen improviser. And we can talk about actually the relationship between musical form as in fact an enabling constraint constraint and enablement or constraint and free lunch is a false dichotomy, right? A constraint is a form of enablement for the emergence or the achievement of definite outcomes, but they're not determined by that constraint, right? The constraint, in a sense, defines an arena, and there may be, any number of ways of traversing that arena, and they are not. I think it's a mistake to think of those possibilities, those paths, as existing as a bunch of discrete paths prior to their traversal. So yeah, there's lots there.
So could I ask? That's an interesting point, right? And as I said, I agree that these things are changeable and so on.
Mhm.
But especially in the case of, for example, synthetic beings that have never been the subject of specific selection, and you make these things, and they have very coherent sets of forms and behaviors. If these things didn't exist prior to the creation of the physical interface, you can tell a story, right? The standard story is the slow and gradual process of evolution. That's what nailed this particular kind of thing. But when they show up, just like that, like where, if it didn't pre-exist, when does it and how does it show up?
Yeah, I mean it's a vexing question, and I think this is partly why we have the philosophical research program that is adjacent to the empirical research program, and why an examination of Platonism is actually the right thing to do, and the different sources or the different active principles within that, and that's again a big subject in and of itself. But if you're looking at something like a differential field as primordial but indefinite but unstable, as a kind of primordial active principle, which in Platonic terms we can start thinking about the fusion of the chora and the one, and that's where some process philosophers go. That's something we would need to sketch in and of itself. But you can look at the fact that the thing is always this potential that is inherent to like matter itself, let's say, is always pressing against, looking to overflow these contextual constraints. So the constraints of any particular actual arrangement, right? And so if you change the actual arrangement, what's going to happen is that previously canalized potential is going to overflow and reorganize itself into something else, right? But what's being drawn upon is not really it's the combination between the definiteness or the determinacy which exists in the actual and the excessive inexhaustible potential which kind of underpins everything in this sort of view. So where it comes from is it's brought into existence, that determinate pattern is brought into existence by this particular relational nexus, which is precise. I mean, you can think about it in exactly the terms that you're thinking about it. You've created a novel actual system, and I mean, you've said yourself, of course, that xenobots are partly the consequence of a long evolutionary history, in the sense that those cells have learned a lot through the evolutionary history of multicellularity. So they are doing things that are at least partly predicated or not determined by, but dependent on that particular history. But you're creating a novel actuality, never before seen in the world, completely novel, completely agree with that. But it has this charge of potentiality, which is still canalized, it's still constrained by various actual features of the cells themselves, right? But is not constrained by, as you've articulated nicely in other contexts, the population of cells that previously was holding it in place and saying you are a skin cell because you're here in this relational network. Okay, now we're out of that relational network, but we're taking a lot of our constraints with us. We've got this charge of potentiality, which may sound really wishy-washy, but that's something we can build up. Again, as part of this research program, there's the philosophical aspect, but there's the mapping this across the diverse domains of science and what someone like Gilbert Simondon would call genetic encyclopedism. And thankfully, the free energy principle actually shows us partly how that kind of thing can be done. And just because it is a series of generalizations. So, again, that's another aspect here. But you've got this potentiality, you've got a novel actuality, and their union is what brings that new pattern into existence. It doesn't pre-exist as predefined in the virtual space. That's the way, that would be the hard processual. And again, you can talk about the ways in which Whitehead might feel a little bit uneasy even about that, but the more even slightly more thoroughgoing process ontology, maybe of someone like a Gilles Deleuze or a Gilbert Simondon, which is more minimalist again than Whitehead, even though at least Deleuze takes a lot from Whitehead. That's the kind of thing you'd be looking at. And again, that can be rationalized, I'm going to shut up now, but as an extension from Platonism itself. So it's still in that Platonic tradition. It's just it's a difference of emphasis and a rearrangement of the way the operators that Plato defined actually work together.
Hmm. So one issue that I think that will always be brought up in this context, if you take this like a research project like Mike's, where you say, okay, what you're actually doing is creating pointers into some ideal realm or virtual realm or however you want to call it, and everything that you do is basically something like that. And then the question is, if you then want to talk about this transcendent or virtual realm beyond, how can you do that? And where do, like, also empirically or scientifically, what's, so to say, the methodology that you need to use there? And it seems to be very difficult, and that's very a kind of Kantian-like point, where you say also the interface theory suggests something which is very similar, that our conceptual tools are not, so to say, made for exploring that realm. But we still want to explore the realm. So there seems to be an obvious tension. And the question is how to get across this issue, right? And how to resolve it. How to make sure that the relations between the patterns, or whether it's a process of emergence or evolution or whatever that happens in the ideal realm, how is that different? Or isn't that only a kind of more abstract way of talking about what we empirically find? So when you mention, for example, the free energy principle, how can something which is remotely similar to a free energy principle tells us something about the Platonic space? Why isn't it just the abstraction from some empirical processes that we see? So there's this skeptical question. It's always
Yeah, and there's always an irreducible skeptical question, and I think we will need to be very careful and sophisticated about the way we handle the nature of transcendentals, and that could be pluralized, by the way, but like those horizons, and also the nature of what we're saying is on the other side of it. Like, as we discussed in email, are we saying that there is a an absolute truth or an absolute nature of things that we don't have access to, or are we going in a more relational direction and saying that what is actual, what is real, is at least to some extent determined in these relations of adjacency, and so we're going more in a perspectivist view, a perspectivist ontology. I mean, there's a lot of different options in this space. Is all I want to say, and I think Mike is showing one way that you absolutely can experimentally, empirically investigate the structure of that latent space. But sorry, I think I jumped in. Mike was gonna
No, that's
comment.
okay. Finish your thought. I'll.
But well, so I think what you're really what one might be looking at here is a kind of multi-pronged, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research program aimed at kind of getting to the bottom of some of these vertiginous philosophical questions and the way they interface with empirical science and empirical reality. And so on the one hand, kind of what you're looking for still, it's a very, classic sort of approach in physics, right, is invariance. So you're still looking for invariant structures, and you are, you're trying to look at the horizon, right, and read these invariant structures off it by, as we say in evolutionary thought, reconstructing the ancestral or primordial states, inferring them, of course, based on extant variation. So you're looking at what's like to the empirical part of it, and where something like the free energy principle can potentially be useful, is that you are mapping a certain kind of invariant schematism, which again tells us, and there are very important and principal ways to connect the free energy principle to its own kind of origins, and like Hermann Haken's synergetics and dissipative adaptation and all of that kind of stuff. These are all things that need to be sketched here, and then the way that those principles have sort of transcended their own, let's say, thermodynamic origins, what's going on in quantum information, like things that Chris Fields is all over, what's going on in quantum information theory, what's going on then in the more like purely mathematical side of things, like I gestured towards topos theory, homotopy type theory, and what are the analogies there? So can we find invariant operations that are at least analogically, but operationally so, not just that they look like each other, but that they are, formally, operationally, essentially isomorphies in these diverse domains. So you have the mathematics story. What are the accounts of the origins of structure in mathematics that are currently being explored, right? You have the more or less empirical story. Mike's research program itself is kind of at the center of that, but it's this, genetic encyclopedism. It's looking at how in diverse domains, from the quantum to the thermodynamic to evolutionary biology and et cetera, systems self-organize, and the origins of novelty in each of those domains. And then it's also the philosophical story, like what have indeed, as they appear to have, it's striking if you read the Timaeus that all of these thought forms are pretty much in there, at least in an incipient form. Again, history of philosophy, series of footnotes to Plato and all of that. To what extent have the things that we're seeing in these different and very contemporary and very sort of cutting edge research programs also been, discovered as thought forms in the history of philosophy, and what ontological options might we recover from there? So it's kind of like at least three-pronged in that sort of sense, because you're asking like really, really deep questions, obviously. And I think that, interface theory, which I'm not super familiar with, but what I take from what you're saying and our previous discussions and my very limited engagement with Donald Hoffman's work is that's an account about how we're going to relate to these transcendental horizons. But that's also what Whitehead is doing. That's what all these guys are doing. Deleuze calls his philosophy transcendental empiricism. James Bradley called Whitehead's philosophy a transcendental cosmology. Like these are all post-Kantian philosophers, and they're all just as they're recognizing that we don't want to be anti-Platonic, they're not anti-Kantian, but they are wondering, like, to what extent can a very rigorous study of the empirical world, the mathematical world, etc., enable us to reconceptualize our relationship with horizons and boundaries, so that we're not just Kantians per se, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of other interesting things that may or may not lead lead to this in the research program. One is, I think especially in neuroscience, we're starting to see, at least I think so, that our understanding of the mapping between the pointer to the thing it pulls down is actually not very good. And the reason I say that is because we just Karina Kaufman, a student of mine, and I just reviewed a bunch of those cases where, like just as an example, there was a guy that had a third of the cortex of a brain volume of a chimpanzee, and he had above normal intelligence and was doing a master's degree in math and things like this. I mean, we clearly don't understand, right? And it's not that you can't tell some kind of story of redundancy after you hear about these things or something like that, but we don't have a theory that would actually predict that would happen, right? It's a bunch of epicycles you have to put onto things later to somehow shoehorn this in to your assumptions, and it doesn't fall out of anything that we know about neuroscience. Where it's in cases like this where you seem to get a lot more out than what you put in, and understanding that kind of mismatch in these cases, I think might be very relevant. Other examples are other scenarios where you have causal drivers that don't map nicely onto any physical structure, and I'm talking about virtual governors and effective networks, and things like when you train these gene regulatory networks that are fixed, the hardware is completely fixed, and people say, well, like the reviewers to our papers, like, well, where's the memory? And you could show them what happened after. It's a dynamical systems thing, and you can show them the causal the effective network after training. You say, well, where is that network? Well, it's not in the hardware. Like where is it, right? And or Darcy Thompson's his have you seen this, the grids, right? So in his book on growth and form, he shows you take a species of an animal and you put it on a mathematical on a grid, on a Cartesian grid, and then you do a mathematical deformation to the grid, and what you get is a different species that also exists, right? And so since then, what was that, the 20s, 30s? Since then, where's the grid? Like what is this grid? And so I think partially in answer to your question of what is the how do we describe the contents of that space? I think these are the kinds of tools, these kinds of mostly mathematical, but also I would argue psychological. I would argue some of the stuff we get out of psychology are probably really what you're talking about are patterns in this space. But these mathematical objects that are I think functionally really critical for not just for explaining what you see, but for driving the next discovery, for making functional changes, for controlling in an engineering context. I think that's the beginnings of the kind of thing we need to describe the patterns in the space. They're going to be behavioral patterns. They're going to be geometric patterns. Yeah, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with the assertion that we don't have a good mapping, and I think we've been laboring under an ontology which gives us a history of false problems, certainly in the history of modern science and with the mechanical philosophy. But I do think in a way this also goes back to Plato. So whilst we can see, Whitehead's characterization of the history of philosophy as a sort of lionization of Plato, which it is, and it should be, because he's this towering genius, it's also an indictment of the history of philosophy in a certain sense. And that's why an exploration of these options is required, even though we may end up in a place that's recognizably kind of quasi-Platonic. But yeah, so I'm in full agreement with you there. I think the question again, we have this question that you brought up earlier about where the agency is and whether these forms themselves have agency, or whether they are just a more classical kind of formal causation, which is a constraint on some fundamental activity or agency. That's the account that I prefer. But again, there's a ton of work to be done. And my interest is certainly not even remotely saying that, we have, or I have, or anybody has the answers, but it's given that I'm coming out of this evolutionary perspective, and as I have, you know, diversified my interests. I mean, maybe I'm just a crazy person because that's my frame, but you know, as my interests spread out from evolutionary biology into other domains of science, but into the history of philosophy, I've become very interested in the general nature of this way of thinking about, you know, Genesis, ontogenesis, etc. And again, how broadly can we apply that kind of framing? And just an interesting thing is that wherever I look, including again, work in the foundations of mathematics that's very contemporary, there is a recognizably, at least process-based framing that's being deployed there. I also want to say I very much agree about the psychological. I think all of the philosophers that we've referred to today, even in passing, would very much agree with that. Many of them were trying to connect, you know, deep questions about the nature of lived experience with the science of their times or with, you know, mathematical frameworks. Certainly, I noticed that you referenced Jung a couple of times in your paper on, and that's a whole other conversation. You know, I've done quite a bit of work on Jung, and I don't know if you've seen some of the dialogues that I've done with Matt Siegel on Jung, but you might find some of them interesting because again, Jung himself admits of quite different readings. I mean, he's very frustratingly you know, self-contradictory and inconsistent in many of his expressions, but there's definitely a lot of stuff to work through there. And a philosopher who I've name dropped a couple of times, who I think in some ways he's like my current guy, let's say, for exploring this to the hilt is Gilbert Simondon, this mid-20th century French philosopher. And he's deeply influenced by Jung, actually, which is very unusual amongst, like, you know, kind of serious academic philosophers, even at that time. And he has many big books, but his biggest book is called Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. And it's where he rolls out this approach of genetic encyclopedism, where he tries to map an operational schema of individuation, which does not presuppose the individual, which does not presuppose the existence of a determinate form, basically, because he thinks that's begging the question. He tries to derive a minimal operational schema for the process of individuation that doesn't presuppose the individual by mapping it across all these domains from quantum mechanics to culture and society, right? But very, very rigorous at the level of detail that he applies.
Actually, I have a question to both of you. I think, Timothy, you said it in passing, but I wasn't sure whether I understood it correctly. So, Mike, you said somewhere in our conversation, like half an hour ago or so, something like, we don't, when we do AI and people are talking about AI consciousness nowadays, we don't create consciousness, but we interface to consciousness. And that's roughly what I believe, right? So we don't create consciousness. Consciousness is not something that we can create. It's fundamental, but we can interface to it. And we can make interesting interfaces. Now, the second thing, so that's true for consciousness. The second thing, which I think, it's not only about consciousness, but it's also about agency. And we talked about agency a lot. So it seems to me, or I would say agency is something which belongs to this virtual ideal realm and not to the empirical realm. But that's not how a lot of people now think about agency. So even I would say in the, let's say, non-reductionist literature, you find this idea that we create this kind of complicated embodiments, and from that you get agents. And I would make the distinction between agents and embodiments of agency, right? Embodiments of agency are just embodiments of agency. They're not agents themselves. Agents are something which belongs to the virtual or to the transcendental realm, so to say. Now, my question would be whether you share that or how you think about this idea. So how do you think agency, so to say, what's the role of agency? Is it something which is an empirical notion which belongs to the physical world, or is it something which is also reached by these pointers, so to say?
Yeah, I mean, for me, and I've certainly will in the earlier stuff that I was writing, because I was trying to cement some things before getting into this weird stuff, right? So you know, you can't do everything at once, right? People just completely turn off. So I've done a lot of stuff in diverse intelligence and collective intelligence and so on, where I say, oh look, you know, the agent is formed by the parts aligned. ultimately that was just loose vocabulary. I mean, I really think what I agree with what you just said, that I think what we build our interfaces and the agency is elsewhere. But the one thing I'll just describe quickly is we have a minimal model of something that I think is interesting, and that is that I think these pointers are not even necessarily physical objects like embryos or biobots or whatever. We have a minimal model of this in algorithms, and what we have this work on these sorting algorithms. These are dirt simple things, bubble sort and things like this, and this is why I get really frustrated when people say, oh, these AIs, well, I make them, I know what they are, I write them. And I think, you don't even know what bubble sort is. We make these things. We do not. I don't think we understand at all the things that we're pulling down. So what we see about this is you have your algorithm, and the system does do what the algorithm says to do, and that's the constrained part, and that's the part that we can't escape either as physical. In physical embodiments, you got to obey the laws of chemistry. There's no way around it. However, they also, first of all, they exhibit interesting competencies to address the problem you force them to address in new ways that you actually didn't tell them about. That's A. And B, while doing that, they also have these interesting side quests where they do some other stuff that wasn't in the algorithm at all. And so I think what's happening there is when you make these things, you get three things. You get the thing you wanted it to do. If you did it right, you get the thing you wanted it to do. You get some extra competencies in doing that thing that you actually didn't put in. And then you also get some other stuff that isn't what you wanted at all. It's just it's a side thing that's where it's like a super minimal version of agency where, and people say, well, machines are, you make them do, you can make them do some stuff just like we are forced to do some stuff. But even the dumbest, simplest machine is doing some things, I think, besides what you wanted it to do, what you told it to do. And it's not just complexity, it's not just unpredictability, it's not just random stuff. It's something that we clearly would recognize if we saw a creature doing it. It's something that we clearly recognize as a kind of very simple mind of some sort. So that's what I think about the agency, right? Is that you can try to force it to do things, and if you're a good engineer, you will force it to do some things, but you're going to get more than you put in. You're going to get some stuff that you actually did not put in, and there, that is where we have to start trying to understand the mappings of the pointer to that space and what is in the space. Because I actually think that in building some of the new robotics and some of the AI systems, I don't think you're getting human minds, but I do think we're now fishing in a region of that space that maybe we've never pulled from before. We're getting some pointers to things that, at least on this planet, probably have never come out. So yeah, that's my take on it.
I know we're almost out of time, and this is just a huge question. So slightly nomically, I'd say something like, I don't think the forms have agency, but that agency requires the forms. Mm-hmm. So I would, again, it'll hinge on the way we think about the Cora in the Timaeus, and its relationship to Heraclitus. In a sense, you could say that I'm a Heraclitean. Again, very coarse-grained way of putting it. But what is fundamental is like drive, basically, is generativity, differential generativity. This would actually flip classical thermodynamics, by the way, in the sense that entropy would not fundamentally be an index of like disorder, but actually the source of novel order primarily, like initially, and then the dissolution of established order is a secondary kind of emergent process there. That's a long story to tell in and of itself. But so I think we'd be able to find an account, Robert, where my position would dovetail with yours, but I think, again, some of the operators are going to be maybe almost inverted. And I'm a sort of, having said all of that, a little bit of an anti-substantialist on some level, in that I think it's kind of just wrong to say things like, consciousness is fundamental or matter is fundamental or something like that. I think that whatever we're dealing with here in terms of the most generic nature of reality doesn't accord with those descriptions as we normally use them. So using those terms is already bringing a bunch of baggage into the discussion that I'd rather start without that. If we're going to really go down to brass tacks, I'd rather start without that. But if pushed, I'd basically say agency is canalized drive, and drive is fundamental, right? But agency is driving towards some particular goal, and that requires constraint, right? That requires organization. But what's really kind of agential, or what's driving a system forward, is something that's more fundamental and is always excessive. So no matter what the constraint function, it is going to deviate from that at some level, because in another way of putting it, it's a random dynamical system. And so it's always got the dissipative generative term in the Langevin equation as well as the solenoidal term, right? So there's always drift. Drift is inexorable. Drift can't be stopped. And again, that's one of the ways that I bring it back to my grounding in evolutionary biology. Like these are all very related things for me. But there is I noticed, Mike, you've been talking with Brandon and McShay. I do like to talk about the zero force evolutionary law. And the ontological correlate of the zero force evolutionary law is like fundamental drive, which is essentially a Heraclitean way, or the way Nietzsche would take that. But again, long story.
What's that? The zero? Sorry, I don't know that.
The zero force evolutionary law, in its most basic sense, is just saying that change will happen. That things are always varying, and that is grist for the mill of selection. So when you have the generalized selectionist triad, right, variation, selection, heritability, which is really a pre-Darwinian thing, but then particularly Darwin develops it, Charles Sanders Peirce codifies it, says all logic is in different ways a variation of that. And then Richard Lewontin, of course, famously as a 20th century evolutionary biologist, describes it in that way. But basically, she's saying variation is fundamental and is a dynamical term. Like variation is always accruing. It cannot be stopped. So like drift is always happening in a sort of genetic sense, right?
All right, Robert, you got the last word for tonight.
Well, I don't know. I think it's totally exciting. I mean, and we're discussing all this abstract and complex stuff, and it's really interesting. But I think this question, how to break it down to concrete, empirical, scientific research programs, that's really the interesting question. And that's one of the things which I really like about Mike's research. It's one of the few research programs that I know who take a kind of, let's say, non-standard philosophical, conceptual approach and try to make it into something very tangible. And I think that's what we need to do at the moment. I mean, that's really where we need to go. And my hope is that some of the questions, of the more complex questions, will be resolved, or at least we will see some solutions to that by going through that. And we don't need to endlessly debate about things and going back and forth. And it has happened for I don't know how many millennia now. So I really think if we can manage to break that down into some concrete tasks, empirical tasks, something which I can give to my undergraduate students, that would be really progress.
Cool.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah.
Let's come back if we come back in a couple of months. We have a few pretty crazy things cooking. We need to finish this up, and we'll come back in a couple of months, and I'll show you some data. We've been doing some wild stuff on the transcriptomics of these novel synthetic organisms, because they have an extremely different transcriptome. They're doing some very wild things, and we're also investigating some more very basic cellular automatons, some things that look again minimal things that look pretty stupid and mechanical, and it turns out that that's not it at all. So we'll come back, and I'd love to get your take on some of these things.
Fantastic.
Okay. Amazing, guys. Thank you so much. Super interesting.
I thank you very much for your time, and great to meet you, Timothy.
Oh, great to meet you too, Robert. And yeah, thanks, Mike. And I was just chatting to Matt Siegel about this, because he's been reading your Platonic space paper as well, and we're going to chat about it actually tomorrow, as you've given us permission to. Cool. And we both really agree strongly that it's just wonderful that you are so open to engaging with people from obviously diverse academic backgrounds, and like wading into this the philosophical fray, so to speak, but precisely as Robert says, with that empirical counterpart. And that's really rare. And I think it is something absolutely to be celebrated. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, and I appreciate a lot that you guys are going to go through it. I'm gonna obviously listen carefully to that. I'm pretty sure one thing I need to, because I don't have a real background in the historical philosophy or anything. So getting the terminology, I need to figure out if are we keeping this terminology because it kind of sounds like things people have said, or do we actually need new terms because we're not really sticking to it. Like, I don't know. So you guys are the experts. So I'll listen to it, then we'll figure it out.
Welcome.